Aloha, welcome to the 40th Annual Hawaii International Film Festival presented by Halekulani and our discussion with Jennifer Abbott and Joel Backen, directors of a powerful new documentary, The New Corporation. We would like to extend our thanks to our sponsors for our festival and our documentary panorama section. So some quick housekeeping bits. For up-to-date information and additions to our program and the full schedule of films, events, HIFF talk story sessions, and Q&As, please visit our website at hiff.org. And to participate in our Hawaii News Now Audience Award voting, please head to hawaiinewsnow.com/HIFF to cast your vote for your favorite narrative, documentary, and short film. Mahalo to Hawaii News Now for their support. Okay, Jennifer Abbott and Joel Backen, thank you so much for being here with us, albeit virtually right now. A lot of the information you present in this documentary is fairly public knowledge already, but it's the way you synthesized all this information together that's really thoughtful, provocative, infuriating, and inspiring. So, thank you. My first question is, what spurred you on to do this follow-up of your 2003 documentary, The Corporation?
Yeah, I started thinking about it about 10 years after the first film came out in 2003, 2004. We were having a 10th anniversary celebration screening. And it occurred to me that there wasn't really much to celebrate, that all the problems that we had looked at had become worse, whether it was climate change, the corrosion of democracy, racial, gender, economic inequality. All of these things were more problematic than they had been. Corporations were bigger, they were more powerful, they were more influential over government than they had been. And at the same time, corporations were now saying that they were the good guys. You know, they were new corporations. They were going to save the world rather than harm the world. And so it was that confluence of things that I thought, you know, there isn't much to celebrate here 10 years after the first film. Obviously, we generated a discussion with that film, but it didn't really lead to the kind of change that we were hoping for. So it seemed important to have another kick at the can, and I started thinking and writing towards creating the sequel, and also the book that I wrote along with making the film, which is published in the U.S. by Penguin Random House.
And for me, it was actually very different. Joel and I really do agree, but I, on the other hand, was very reluctant to make the sequel. I mean, for one, I really feel it was some of the best work I had ever done, and I just wanted it to stand alone. Also, I think part of the reason was because of the roles I played in the first film. I co-directed with Mark Akbar, but I also edited the film. And it was just like, I cut that film from 400 hours of footage. And it was like, it was such a monster of a film. And I just really couldn't imagine trying to wrestle another monster like it to the ground. I was also deep in the trenches working on another film, which is also being released now, called The Magnitude of All Things. So I was very reluctant. That said, there was a triggering moment, which was Donald Trump's election. It wasn't as if everything suddenly changed then. In many ways, Trump is a symptom of 40 years of neoliberalism. But what happened for me in that moment was the veil came down. There was no longer even the pretense that corporations and government were acting independently. And there they were, having the audacity to rig the system in front of our eyes in the favor of the plutocratic class. So it was at that moment that I felt there were compelling reasons to undertake a sequel.
Great, thank you so much. I can definitely imagine how difficult, putting together all of this footage must have been. Definitely.
I should say, not to interrupt you, but I really have to do a shout out to our editor of The New Corporation, because I did not edit this one. Peter Rowick did a fabulous job and deserves a lot of credit.
That's awesome. Definitely. Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, it's definitely a compelling documentary looking at how government and corporations have been working together. But, it's actually particularly resonant here in Hawaii, especially the intentional use of the word colonialism in key parts of the documentary. Since here in Hawaii, it has a history of private corporations not only stealing public lands, but also outright occupying an independent nation. But while this makes more sense here in Hawaii, it may not seem as apparent back in continental US and perhaps even other countries such as Canada. Can you possibly expound on this a bit more and perhaps elaborate on corporations' seemingly hidden or not so hidden political clout?
Yeah, I think that Hawaii is an incredible example. The Dole company, for example, and other companies moving into Hawaii as though they owned the place, which eventually they effectively did. And one of the points we try to make in the film is that you can't really understand corporate capitalism without understanding that the capital that was originally created historically back in the 18th century when our current system began to really take shape was capitalism extracted through colonialist economies and through slave economies in the United States and other countries, through the Caribbean slave economies, colonial economies in terms of dispossessing indigenous peoples from their lands in Hawaii, in the United States, in what is now the United States, in what is now Canada. That the land that was used for agriculture, the land that was used for manufacturing, for railways, for all of that was taken, either taken directly through force or taken through unfair and one-sided treaties. But in both instances, it was taken. And that when you look at the operation of modern capitalism, the money that is circulating around the world through Wall Street, through the city of London, through Brussels, through all of these countries, that money you can trace directly back to capital that was created through the dispossession and often the slaughter of indigenous peoples throughout the world, and through the enslavement of entire populations captured in Africa and in other countries, and then enslaved, and their labor literally stolen from them without any compensation or remuneration. So it's impossible to separate out the operation of modern capitalism from those colonialist roots and from those roots in slave-based economies.
Thank you so much for that. Would you like to add anything, Jennifer?
Oh, I thought that was great. I agree. Not great. I agree wholeheartedly. Well articulated.
Great, thank you. And that's really one of the things I appreciated about your documentary is that in addition to this political and economic analysis, you tied back into historical analysis as well. And one of the main arguments of your film is that we are experiencing the end of enlightenment. Could you talk a bit more about the Age of Enlightenment and how this historical period possibly relates to us today?
Sure. Well, for people who have seen the film, of course, we open with Wendy Brown, who in such a sort of magnetic way discusses really how the rise of neoliberalism especially over the last 40 years has been a turn away from the Enlightenment project, which is by no means perfect, by the way, but did have an element where there was an aspiration for human beings to aspire to be the best they could through reflection and education and a real sense of citizenship and participation in society. But as Wendy says, that you could make yourself according to your own lights. So that was a fundamental assumption of the Enlightenment period. And then, of course, as we turn towards markets, not only to organize society, to quantify society, to be the arbiter, really, of in some ways, almost ethics in society, we really lose that project. And so I think it's a very somber message, to similarly, we've lost in many ways the aspiration for democracy. It's all aspirational, but it asks these fundamental questions about who do we want to be as a species, right? And how do we want to organize our society? And really the rise of market fundamentalism and neoliberalism really has diminished, in our view, those two projects, which are essential, really, to creating a more compassionate, a more just, and a more livable future.
Yeah, definitely this drive towards achieving perhaps a higher level of humanity, right, was something that Enlightenment thinkers really aspired to, and it really is sobering to think about, how we seem to have fallen so far away from that original goal. So another thing that I really appreciated about your film is that you talk about the pandemic and its roots in corporate greed. On a related note, the global pandemic has put into a standstill a lot of filmmaking here in the US, although I hear that Canada has been more successful. Could you talk a bit more about your process in making this documentary and how you worked through and around the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, we had essentially finished the film when the pandemic hit North America. I mean, we realized that it was necessary to reopen the film because it wasn't just that the pandemic was an important event. I mean, obviously, as documentarians, we can't constantly be, chasing the world as it's unfolding because we would never finish our films. At some point, you have to just say, okay, that's it. We're locking it and we're delivering it. But in this case, the pandemic, not only was it not just another current event, I mean, it was massive in terms of its scope and impact, but also it really touched upon everything that we were talking about in the film. The central argument in the film is, or a central argument, is that corporations are presenting themselves as capable, as publicly minded, and therefore capable of governing society, and that they're on a project of trying to push governments themselves out of those roles and take over those roles. I mean, that is what we're looking at. And I think what the pandemic did in very sort of clear terms was show a number of things. One is we still need government. I think, we were talking earlier about the difference between the response to the pandemic in Canada and that in the United States. Our numbers have been lower, our deaths have been lower, our health system hasn't been overwhelmed. Well, that's not a coincidence. The virus doesn't sort of pull up at the border and say, oh, we're going to stop here. Rather, it's about public policy. And it's about the fact that in Canada, as compared to the United States, there is a much more proactive role on the part of government, not to mention that government runs the healthcare system. But in many different ways, it was much more proactive in terms of unemployment insurance, in terms of PPE supply, in terms of ensuring social distancing and mask wearing and all of that. There's just a different culture in Canada that enables government to actually play a very sort of strong leadership role. I think the absence of that in the United States, especially after several years of the Trump administration at the federal level, very much explains the poorer results in the United States compared not only to Canada, but to other countries as well. But there's another side of the pandemic than just sort of showing, oh yeah, government is still needed. It also showed that corporations don't really step up. You know, they say we're here to solve the world's problems, but basically their response to the pandemic was to line up for bailouts, from the very taxpayers that they were saying, you know, we don't want to pay taxes anymore. And then they're asking taxpayers to bail them out. I mean, it's just ridiculous in all those ways. But I think another thing the pandemic showed was that we, the people, are not necessarily buying the story we've been told for 40 years of rugged individualism and we're all on our own and we're isolated individuals and, you know, it's all about merit and doing our own thing. I think what the pandemic showed is how absolutely interdependent we all are on each other, for good and for ill. For ill in the sense that, you know, we're all giving each other this virus. I mean, we're not in our little isolated pods. But for good in that it was amazing how quickly people started to help each other, how mutual aid societies were formed, how communities were helping people who were in isolation, the elderly and so forth. That all of a sudden these beautiful human instincts that we have are coming out, and we're coming out and really putting a lie to this kind of notion that we're all in it for ourselves that underlies this kind of neoliberal economy and thinking that we've been part of. So I think that's been very important, and also the ecological side of things, which I think Jen speaks to really well in terms of the pandemic.
So I can speak to that then. You know, it was really important for us to include what I feel is a really neglected thread in the narrative of the pandemic. And, you know, that the link between the destruction of nature and these emerging diseases and corporate capitalism's role in the destruction of nature, which we provide empirical evidence for. And, you know, I'm quite distressed that this is referenced so infrequently in public discourse. You know, it really is the case that as a headline we use in the film states very clearly, if we do not halt the destruction of nature, we will face more pandemics. And who knows how, you know, with what virility those new diseases will harm human populations. And the way the destruction of nature really quickly is linked to emerging pandemics, for people who don't know, is that, you know, these are diseases that jump species. So sometimes there's an intermediary host to humans, sometimes it's direct. But how does that happen? It happens when non-human animals become in closer contact with humans, right? And because of the destruction of nature, habitat loss, as well as intensive animal agriculture, provides these opportunities for this contact and for these diseases to jump species. So, I mean, it's not hyperbolic at all to say that if we do not stop the destruction of nature, we will face more pandemics. Likely we will anyway, because of how far the destruction of nature has progressed already. But it really is a very a warning that I hope we use this as a wake-up call, you know, to look deeply at what we are doing, not only to ourselves but other species.
Definitely. I think it's really telling that we would rather believe in, you know, conspiracy theories that this virus was made up than believe that this was our own faults and the faults of the corporations that we have come to rely on. And I certainly agree that this is an important topic that perhaps has not received as much sympathetic media coverage, perhaps because media is also owned by these very corporations. But like, maybe that's another story, or maybe not. And again, this shows the importance of independent films such as yours. So thank you so much again. So my last question is a sort of two-parter. How has your experience making this film shaped you and your thoughts, beliefs, and what's your final message for your film viewers?
Yeah, I think that making the film didn't really, there weren't any revelations in the sense that we kind of had a sense of what we were going to find going into it. I think, the final message for viewers is take your citizenship seriously. Take your understanding of yourselves, your responsibilities, not just your rights, but your responsibilities as active agents in creating a society that is sustainable, in which we can flourish, in which nature and non-human animals can flourish and sustain us, and where there's some kind of harmony, where democracy is not just a sort of thin kind of surface over a lot of undemocratic ways in which we're being governed. And be skeptical. Obviously in a film like this, we can't lay out a 5-year or a 10-year plan or a magic bullet or anything like that. But I think a central message of the film is be skeptical when corporations are telling you that they are the solution to the world's problems. Be skeptical when they say we don't need to be regulated, we can self-regulate. Be skeptical when they say we can run your schools and we can run your water systems. Understanding it's not that this is part of a conspiracy, but it's just the dynamic of corporate capitalism that it needs to grow. It needs to take over more. And it's doing that under the guise of good intentions. And we need to be skeptical about that. And we also need to be less cynical about the possibility of collective action, about the possibility of making our governments genuinely democratic, about the possibilities that we can actually be governed democratically, and that our democratic institutions and our constitutional structure are not half bad. They just need to be made to work properly. And currently they're not, not least because of the degree to which corporate influence has corrupted them and corroded them. So, be less cynical about the possibility of a public, democratic, collective destiny and future, and be more skeptical about the claims of corporations that they can solve all the world's problems.
Yes, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. I would add that for me, unfortunately, I wasn't surprised because, it's hard to be surprised after decades of looking at corporate behavior to think really there's any limits to their harmful behavior. That said, what did surprise me and what was the motivation to open up Picture Lock the second time, and we only had 2 weeks to do it, was the uprising that occurred after George Floyd's brutal murder and the reinvigoration of the BLM movement. It was so essential for us to include it, and we had to lobby hard to do so. And as I said, we had only 2 weeks. But that transformed the whole film to me, and that movement was so inspiring and so full of beauty and truth and power and affect. Like, it's really challenged and exposed racialized corporate capitalism, and the system itself is being questioned. Why is the military and police getting so much public funding, and why our schools and hospitals lacking, for example, the toppling of colonial statues. So for me, it was we wanted to make a film that was inspiring, that was hopeful, but, there's so many reasons to despair. And I do believe that hope can be a form of denial itself. And if we insist on it, when really there's very few reasons to be hopeful. But for me, the Black Lives Matter uprising and its inclusion in our film was, it balanced the scales a little bit, and it showed us what it is because it's being billed as, I believe, the largest activist movement in U.S. history, with 15 to 26 million people involved, right? And one person in a Q&A asked us, well, why did they allow that to happen? And it was just such a curious question, because it's like, no, this is actually, no one is permitting it. In fact, as we know, protesters are being snatched off the streets in unmarked vans. I mean, there's this, and the military is being sent in, but it's happening anyway. And I just feel like it's the message I would like to leave viewers with is, what is this? What spaces can we imagine that are different than the system we currently have, which is a complete social construction? It can be reconstructed. And what's happening now with the Black Lives Matter uprising is just an example that Angela Davis, even said she never could have imagined this in her lifetime. Well, it's happening. So for me, if that's not inspiring and a reason to get up in the morning and just fight as hard as we possibly can for a more just world, I don't know what is. So that's what I'd like to leave viewers with, and we end the film with it. So I hope viewers do feel that inspiration.
Definitely. I felt so despondent and so defeated while watching your documentary. I have to be honest. And then the last 30 minutes after watching all that, I felt so much hope. It felt so. I really felt like, yes, we can definitely do this. We can definitely make change. So, thank you once again. Thank you so much, Jennifer and Joel, for sharing your time and thoughts with us. We're so sorry again that this has to be in this weird online experience, but definitely appreciate you and your film nevertheless. And thank you so much for watching this discussion today. And a special mahalo again to all of our HIFF sponsors, board of directors, and our HIFF Ohana members. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.